Everyone, Holly and I decided to do a live research update today to inform everyone what she and I have been up to, causing trouble in the world of the inform everyone what she and I have been up to. Sorry about the feedback loop I just caused there by launching my browser. Ta-da. So anyway, Holly, welcome back. It's good to have you.
Thanks. I think we've got some interesting research for everyone today, and I hope you enjoy it, everyone. It ties from our research just stemming off of our Salem book and connecting it to Jan's work with the hippie movement.
And oh boy, does it connect, 50 ways from Sunday. Every time we, follow a lead, it's like it's connecting right back into the same, group of people from Harvard. And, we're seeing the exact same patterns. But today we're going to be getting into some more specifics on the Puritans. So let's just dive into it. And, first off, any donations we get today, we really appreciate. We've ordered, quite the stack of books, for research on Salem and all. In fact, there's a whole lot more than that. Any help for expenses, and Holly's got her own stack of books there that she's got and travel and whatnot. And another thing is, I got my car robbed again the other day, and they got about $1,200 worth of stuff. The insurance is covering most of it, but the deductible was $250, and had a rock hit and break the windshield coming back from Arizona. That was another $215, and then 200 books on these books, and another couple of hundred on hers. So we can use all of the help with funds and research we can possibly get. We want to dive in first off. Holly, why don't you dive into the antinomian controversy, because that's really where the dichotomy begins in this whole historical fiasco.
Okay, so if you're watching now, and even if you don't have any money to help, then if you could just share and like the video, and maybe someone else who does have the funds will find us. So, we just decided to go live on a Sunday because we've been doing some interesting research. We were looking into the history of the Puritans and how they came to the United States and how they stemmed as a religious group. So I came across something called the antinomian controversy. And so there's something called divine grace or free grace, or they had several terms for it, but it was the idea of grace versus good acts. So
well, let's go into that. Let's describe that a little bit, what it means, because basically at its root, and I want you to cover this, but at its root, it's the division between God as logos or truth in Christianity, and then the antinomian ideas spins out in Judaism and in the New Age movement, etc.
So antinomianism literally means to be against or opposed to the law. So this stemmed out of Calvinism and Protestantism. So originally, Catholicism talked about good works. So you were judged by your good acts. Being a good Christian meant doing good works. Well, the antinomians and the Calvinists and the Puritans, all these groups that stemmed from this, thought that it had more to do with grace. So you were predestined by God, especially if you had money or acquisitions in this life, that God has given you grace. So you can be forgiven for whatever. It doesn't really matter what your acts are. So antinomianism became very popular in the New World, And Anne Hutchinson, as some people in the audience might know, she founded Rhode Island. She was a fervent antinomian supporter, and she followed John Cotton. And John Cotton ties back to the Salem witch trials. John Cotton's his grandfather, Cotton Mather's grandfather.
Right. So, and then of course, Cotton Mather was one of the presidents of Harvard, et cetera. Thanks, Budcap, for the donation. I hugely appreciate it. We appreciate any donations we can get from the audience right now. You know, we've got way more expenses out in the last week. So all the help Holly and I can get is greatly appreciated. Now, going back to the antinomians now, in my article, Entheogens, What's in a Name, I cited Marlene Dobkin de Rios, the famous ethnobotanist from Cal State Fullerton, and she wrote, substances like ayahuasca create a state of hypersuggestibility in which persons are very open to being influenced by others. Many traditional cultures have utilized this condition to inculcate cultural values and behaviors in young people as they receive initiation into adulthood. In the West, countercultural values can be inculcated in young people when using these psychedelics, especially when using them in an antinomian context. So, you know, right now we're already seeing the bridge between the psychedelic movement and the 1600s Puritans, and this is no joke. And so, you know, for 326 years, we've heard this complete and utter nonsense that the Puritans were Christians. This is one of the biggest farces I think I've ever heard. And the more that I've looked into the Puritans as well as the Protestant Reformation, the whole thing was against logos or truth or righteousness, you know, and truthful behavior as a way to live. And it's everything about its inversion or its opposite. And Mark and Robert and I did the show 2 weeks ago on inversion part 1, and we'll be doing a part 2 on that soon. But I definitely recommend people follow up with that as well, because it explains the whole inversion process. So this antinomianism actually and literally became the foundation for do what thou wilt, by the Satanist Aleister Crowley, the B666. So, you know, there is a direct connection between antinomian ideals and the Puritans and Crowley and Satanism and free love, etc.
So antinomianism is against works-based salvation. So this is where the different sects of Puritanism started to separate. So I don't know if you want me to start to jump into that or...
Sure. I mean, yeah. Well, you know, why don't we start first off? Let's take a step back. Probably we should put that first. But why don't we go through like the Puritan origins and how they infected everything, you know? Like, you know, from the Teutonic Knights.
Okay. So that's about as far as I can trace it, really. So, I think when I started to look at Puritanism coming from Europe, you know, to the United States, in England, it was called antinomianism. In the Dutch colonies, it was called Arminianism. So you can find branches of this type of Puritanism spread into the different, I guess you could call them nations of Europe at the time. And before that, it stemmed from the Commonwealth or from Parliament, or it goes back to the Magna Carta, this type of use of promoting, basically it's kind of, people think of it as like modern day communism. So the Commonwealth and the Magna Carta, if you look into what that was about, it's no taxation without representation. So the overarching theme is to basically have this group go against the monarchy and natural law, if you really want to get into that. And then it seems that the Magna Carta, which when I was in school, I was taught that it was, you know, liberating to the people. And that's what America's republic democracy was based off of. But once you start to look at it from this Puritan angle, you see that both sides are usually controlled, going back to Teutonic era.
Right, and so then the Magna Carta becomes the Parliament, and then they use these things to then take away, let's say, culture building behavior, and use it to promote degenerate behavior via laws, like we see with the promotion of, banning. If you go to jail if you use the wrong gender pronoun for somebody who makes up, whatever gender that they are, etc. So we see all of these things leading to this, even free speech we can see being used to undermine certain cultural values, like what's his name from Hustler magazine, when he used free speech to publish more and more porn, etc. So
Larry Flint. So you're talking about?
Yeah, Larry Flint. And thank you, King TL, for your donation as well. We really appreciate all the support. Anyone, please support and donate. It's funny, we always have these silly trolls who thumb down this show. It's like we haven't even started hardly, and they're already thumb downing the episode. It's like, people seriously need to grow up and go get a life. I call them the Joe trolls, But anyway, let's get on here. So let's talk about Marymount now. The Puritans, and Amon is having a bit of a fit there. But it's all right. So Marymount was an offshoot of the Puritans. You want to cover that, Holly?
Okay, so I think we touched a little bit on this in our last update, but I found out about a colony that was originally called Mount Wollaston, and it's now in Quincy, Massachusetts, but it was called Marymount, and his name was Thomas Morton. He was a Puritan who founded his own colony after Wollaston was kicked out, and they erected a maypole in 1628. And people were supposedly complaining that there was, drunkenness and dancing and getting along with Native women, etc., and just causing a ruckus. So the Puritans had to go in and shut it down, even though Thomas Morton himself was a Puritan and all these people were also Puritans. And then Thomas Morton was thrown out a bunch of times, came back, thrown out, came back, and finally he ended up advocating for the Massachusetts Bay Corporation and the Massachusetts Bay Colony to fuse together into the Massachusetts Commonwealth. So he created the fusion of basically communism and corporatism, which Puritanism had pushed for from the very beginning.
And then we should also point out that he was the lawyer who broke the original Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter by the Pilgrims, I believe, to promote the one by the Puritans. Now, the Pilgrims were, in fact, Christians. The Pilgrims were Christians. The Puritans were actually Jews who had, quote-unquote, converted to Puritanism during Judaism's outlaw in Europe for human sacrifice, and they were doing Kabbalistic sophistry. There was a lot of other stuff going on, usury, etc. People can look up historically. There's quite a number of court documents still available of what was going on. Of course, today it's all downplayed and what was really happening. So this guy, Thomas Morton, and I mentioned this in a show recently, I believe, or posted somewhere, that I thought that Timothy Leary was an amalgamation of Thomas Morton at Marymount and whom else did I say? Now I'm forgetting.
You also said Cotton
Mather. Right. So, and then I did, in fact, find citations for Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters directly citing Thomas Morton as the foundation of their origins. So now we have yet another. So we already talked about Marlene de Rios. Now we have Ken Kesey tying to Thomas Morton. And again, I think that Leary, of course, Leary and these guys were all out of the psychology and social relations department at Harvard. Harvard is in Massachusetts, where all of this stuff went down, and it all ties together. It's such a ridiculous little cell once you get in there and you start seeing what they're doing. But studying the inversion and their techniques is really key to understanding how they did things. So now what we have is Marymount branches off from the Puritans. And we know it's a Puritan sect. They're the perverted Puritans, let's say, and then those become the merry pranksters and the 60s psychedelic revolution being promoted by Timothy Leary, et cetera. In fact, I can probably even bring up the database here and start going into some of these. But let's see, we had let's go into Marymount. And so this is the Wollaston colony, and we can see, and we're going to go into some of this, but they're tied in with Mayday, utopianism, communism. They're the English dissenters, and then they create the merry pranksters. They're involved in maypole rituals and all of this stuff, like Holly just mentioned. And, so again, it's like we think that these are disconnected historical events, but what we're seeing is it's the exact same stuff happening in the late 1600s and again in the 1960s, and then we can also see patterns of it happening in the 17 and 1800s as well.
So I think a lot of these Puritan groups were interested in something called Christian Hebraism. And I think this also connects in with, Christian Zionism as we move forward with like the history of Christianity in the United States and Protestant religion. So a lot of them are calling for like the end times, end of the world. And they always also promote, so the Puritans, we have this idea of like the Puritan work ethic and strict rules and Puritanism really making and founding America, while at the same time they're also promoting all this degeneracy. And so 1628 was Marymount, but there was also the English Commonwealth under Cromwell, and that didn't happen until a few years later. So this was 1649 that the Commonwealth took a hold after originally it was King James who wanted to reform the English church back to its Christian roots, and his son Charles I and his wife wanted to ban the Puritans from England because they were just causing havoc in England. So Cromwell, who was a Puritan, launched his war and subsequently his religious psyops, as we see in 1649.
And in 1960. Now, officially when you read through all of these books like this one, New Israel, New England, Jews and Puritans in Early America, most of these books use this nonsense term Christian Hebraism because they want the public to think that it's Christians pretending to be Jews. But when you realize that Judaism was outlawed at the time in most countries except for Germany, Holland, and they were allowed as Puritans in England at the time. But you get that it's inverted. So more properly, this is Hebraic Christianism. So what we're going to do is we're going to invert their inversion back properly to the way it should properly be. So it's Hebraic Christianism, or pseudo-Christians. It's Jews pretending to be Christians, and then they're doing this behavior and then pointing at the Christians as it's the Christians doing it. So it's constantly the same inversion that we showed, a few weeks ago. So, we see this exact same tactic happening throughout history. Now, thanks again for the donations for this episode. Again, we mentioned at the start of the show, and there's a lot of people watching now. I was robbed this week out of my car. They stole about $1,200 worth of stuff, so there's a $250 deductible. Windshield got shattered from a semi truck coming back from the Grand Canyon. Another $215. Plus, we've got several $100 wrapped up in books. So, we ask everyone for any donations and support you can offer. We really appreciate it. Maybe we should sit here and beg for money for like 5 minutes until we get a $100 donation from someone like Pacifica would do or something. That's cruel. But there wasn't just one offshoot group of the Puritans. There were others. So, Holly, do you want to discuss the Diggers?
Okay, so what happened here when Cromwell took over and Charles I was publicly beheaded, and this was called regicide, and so the Commonwealth took over, and basically, Cromwell was declared, de facto ruler of England. And after this happened, I'm trying to remember what his name, Manasseh bin Israel. I should have pulled him up. He worked with Cromwell. They legalized, Judaism within England, and they allowed Judaism to be legalized in the Caribbean. So that's how it connects into Barbados and Jamaica. And Jan has been doing some great research on pirates and lots of other stuff connecting to the Puritans. So as they spread into New England and across England, they split up in 1649, originally into like 3 or 4 different groups. One was called the Levelers, one was called the Ranters, and we have the Diggers. And, lo and behold, I had read something that they inspired some of the hippie movement in the 1960s. And I was like, Jan, have you ever heard of this? Like the Levelers or the Diggers? And he's like, yeah, I already have them in the database. So there was another connection that we found.
Right. So. Yeah. So yet another connection between the absurd ridiculousness. And thanks, Lex Van and Brian, for the quick chat, Snapchat, whatever it's called, donations just now. Really appreciate that. So a few years ago, I was researching the Diggers, and I posted a little funny thing on Facebook the other day, just kind of going into all of this. But so in the 1960s, there was this group of scumbags. Some of them were still around. One of them was Peter, and that's just my opinion. Excuse me for any of you of those happy with their litigious nature. One was Peter Coyote, who's the, of course, movie star and documentary film narrator, and he was a member of the New Left, of course. For those, Peter Coyote is a pretty famous actor. There's plenty of movies out there with him in it. He even did like the voiceover in Jack Hare's hemp, video years ago, part of the Village Voice people with Allen Ginsberg and Ezra Pound and all of these people. So, tied with the Greenwich Village MK Ultra team run by the CIA out of Greenwich Village with all of these agents and troublemakers there. Of course, Aleister Crowley was in there, Daniel Pinchbeck, Jack Kerouac, Joyce Johnson, Daniel's mother, Ronald Stark Shitsky, the LSD manufacturer and dealer and killer. And so this is the Diggers, excuse me, and then so we've got Peter Berg here, and it gets back into this Black Bear Ranch up, I think it's in Northern California, where they have all of this stuff going on. I think it was Yeshi or Osha Newman. These guys were all involved in running this. But these are these, connects into these 60s communes. And again, there's another tie between these. So it's these Diggers. And again, we had Marymount with the Merry Pranksters. So we can see this group tying into one of these 60s communes that still runs today. Yeah, it's in Siskiyou County, California, if anybody wants to go up on that. And Peter Coyote involved in that as well. So there's yet another connection. And so getting back to the Diggers, that also ties into Emmanuel Trujillo, and that gets into the Native American Church and some of these other groups. But he is Mana True Hill Cochise. There's evidence that he may have been an agent or something as well, and faking a lot of the stuff, and that's him there. Mana is cool. And more ties to Leary in the database for those who want to investigate that, tied to Walter Boart, Peggy Mellon Hitchcock, who, of course, of the Mellon banking empire. Her brother Billy funded the Millbrook Mansion, which, of course, Tim Leary, Walter Boart, etc., were all at. I think Andrew Weil may have been there as well. But I may be wrong on that, but he apparently knew him as well. And so all of these things start looping back, and we get these cycles of these things happening over the, over centuries. And we see that it's, that these programs didn't start as, say, we originally thought with like the War of the Worlds program. I mean, it's actually going back several centuries further than we had originally believed on this.
So, Jan, can I jump in about just defining what those groups were back in the 1600s?
Absolutely.
Okay, so in the late 1640s, when the Commonwealth was established in England, the three main groups were the Levelers, the Diggers, and the Ranters. And eventually they turned into the Quakers, which you might recognize, audience, and a group called the Fifth Monarchists. So Levelerism produced demonstrations, several thousand people strong throughout London. They provoked serious mutinies in the new model army and occasioned, quote, genuine anxiety among members of the Rump Parliament. That was the condensed parliament that Oliver Cromwell put into power during his Commonwealth. And then the Diggers were involved in experimental communism. So they were the ones who were literally going into public land, like church land, and digging. And that's why they were called the Diggers, because they were planting and creating communes. And then the Ranters were probably the most extreme of the group. They promoted free love, nudity, orgies, drug use, and just general disarray. And because of them, they started to put in, the Puritans had to turn against other Puritans and put in blasphemy laws and cut down on free speech, etc.
And thank you, Ernesto, for the $100 donation just now. We really appreciate that. And, of course, Holly and I need funds for moving Holly out to California and everything soon. Most of you are already aware that Holly and I did get married last month, so thanks for all of your support and everything on that as well. Now, a couple of other points that I want to bring up about the Diggers. And, the Diggers in the 60s, they get really interesting because that gets into the new left as well, like I mentioned. But the Diggers also tie into another group called the Suicide Society. Now, the Suicide Society is very important. The reason why they're important is they tie, they're a similar theme to the Merry Pranksters again, which I had noted in the brain database a couple of years ago when I was mapping this out. They attacked the Mooney cult, interestingly enough. But more interestingly is the Suicide Society becomes, ladies and gentlemen, none other than the Cacophony Society. And what is the Cacophony Society? The Cacophony Society is none other than the group that founded Burning Man, no joke. So Larry Harvey is of the Cacophony Society, started by John Law, Lewis M. Brill, Stuart Mangrum, etc., and the Merry Pranksters. It's a form of Discordian Satanism. Of course, Discordianism, founded by Robert Anton Wilson of the CIA, Kerry Thornley, etc. And most people don't know that, all of your major 60s psychedelic heroes, all of the big ones were all agents. We've got, of course, Bob Dobbs or Dean Everett there, the Church of the Subgenius or whatever. He is a Discordian as well. He might be, his ion suggests that he's Office of Navy Intelligence, which is a pun on the whole water thing. He won't tell me straight up what agency he works for, but, he's some form of intel, and he claims that he heads the Illuminati these days. That's this guy right here, Bob Dobbs, Dean Everett, whatever the heck he's called. And, that's per our personal exchanges and everything with this guy. And so, we're tied again all the way to Burning Man from this same group of people. So we are actually, ladies and gentlemen, at the historical nexus of all of this stuff, coming out of the Jewish Puritans, out of Salem, Massachusetts, and Massachusetts in general. Now, I want to discuss another group for this, and somebody else just donated, excuse me, sorry about that. Somebody just donated $20. Thank you, Perrier Man. We really appreciate that. I keep saying we, that's for both of us, so thank you. And so another group that all connects into, let's go back here just a second, Cacophony, Diggers. All right, so now we're going to go back down through the, where was it? Okay, let's go down. Hold on, I'm forgetting which one of these is the proper connection here now. Okay, so we're going to get into the Chicago 7 now. That was the Yippies, so let me follow it upward here. Okay, so that was the New Left, and then Jerry Rubin, and these guys that called themselves the Diggers of the 1960s, the Diggers and the Yippies. Of course, Walter Board, whom we just mentioned, was one of the first Yippies, and of course Walter Board was intel. He wrote Operation Mind Control, which I've already exposed in my article, Spies in Academic Clothing. But Abbie Hoffman, he was one of these clowns, and that's him here on the screen. He was one of these clowns that started the Chicago riots, and so that was the Chicago 7. And so this group, again, these are directly tied to the Diggers. They're like the modern version of the Diggers. And, of course, we see none other than Senator Tom Hayden there, and, of course, he was married to Jane Fonda. And then, that gets into the whole Young Turks and all that, and we can see a whole other movement there. But, again, we're beginning to see the core foundation of these movements in the late 1600s. Oh, and just one more point. Abbie Hoffman's motto was for the youth to kill their parents. How do you like that? You want to take the next one, Holly? Let's go with, why don't we get into the ranters?
Okay, so I've got some handwritten notes here, and I've got some other notes here, but this is all stuff that I have been finding out about just this week. Like just a couple days ago, I stumbled upon the ranters, and they started in 1649 with these, I'm just calling them straight up psyops, basically, by Cromwell and these Puritan groups. So they rejected heaven. They said that humans are God. They wanted liberalism from all laws. They promoted recreational drugs and swearing, nudity, orgies. So they would talk about free love as in free grace. So divine grace, as I brought up earlier, they believe in predestination. So, you're either chosen or you're not. So don't worry about it. And,
right, and if you're a chosen person, you're chosen already, right?
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter. So they created this uproar within England, and Cromwell had to come to the rescue of everyone, and the Commonwealth had to pass anti-blasphemy laws and other just cutting down on free speech. And then I'm not positive, but I think that this turned into the blue laws, which we have in New England. So Puritanism had to reach back, and they eventually banned Christmas as well. They disallowed the celebration of Christmas in England during this time because they didn't want any sort of, joyous occasions. And this turned into the idea of like the Quakers, and the Quaker meeting, how strict they had to become to fight back against these other crazy Puritans.
All right, I don't know if this Confucius character in there is a troll or not. Keep an eye on him if we need to ban him. Obviously, we got some Joe trolls about. Let's see. So let's get into I want to get into the Muggles here for a minute. Now, the Muggles, or Muggleton, I believe was actually inverted into the non-magical Muggles in the Harry Potter films. And so, it's an inversion like we discussed in the show a couple weeks ago, always this inversion tactic. And let's see. I don't know. I'm just going to ban this person. I don't know what their deal is or if they're a good or bad person. I'm just going to remove them. Excuse the interruption there. Now, let's see.
So I just wanted one thing just for the audience about Muggletonians. According to Wikipedia, they say that they avoided all forms of worship or preaching and met only for discussion and socializing. So these groups all split into more groups and more groups. I think there was like 8. They called them all English dissenters. And all of this started up quick and kind of fell apart quick, except the Quakers escaped and some of the Puritans escaped to the New World. A lot of them never really took hold in the New World, and a lot of them were cut off after Charles II took the throne.
Yeah, and of course, it was Cromwell et al. Who, and in fact, Cromwell is who had King Charles I of England, who was a Stuart, killed, assassinated, so that they could bring in the Commonwealth and communism in England as well as in Massachusetts. Again, today, the state of Massachusetts is still called the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, reflecting all of this. And of course, Harvard et al. Is still promoting this, this same communist agenda, whether it's Leary or James Fadiman or, Ramdas, who's Richard Alpert, etc. All of these clowns out of the CIA's Harvard Social Relations Department under Henry A. Murray et al. And we know that that department is still big in the mind control. But here's the people who had King Charles I beheaded, and then they brought in King Charles II, I think, after they had probably corrupted and controlled him. But basically, they needed to get out the power of natural law and those who ruled by logos or truth, and bring in communism and antinomianism and all of these things, because, of course, they did not believe in truth. They did not believe truth existed, which therefore logos did not exist. And if truth did not exist, God could not exist. So anyone who tells you truth doesn't exist is actually a Satanist by definition. That's an interesting one. So again, everyone, thank you for the donations today. We're trying to cover expenses from mishaps, $1,200 robbery this week, stole a bunch of stuff. Of course, another pair of my glasses were stolen with that. I don't know what is with people who steal from my car. I have had no less than 4 pairs of glasses stolen out of my car when I've left them in overnight. So I've got to go down and pay for a new doctor's visit and all of that, and a new prescription to get the glasses replaced. So all of that is much appreciated. Broken windshields, etc. Hundreds of dollars spent on all of these lovely books to figure out this massive historical scandal. I mean, we haven't even gone into that yet. The plague and the fire, my goodness. And reckless rights, boy, this is another one. The Purim and the legacy of Jewish violence. If you want to get into the real origins of the Puritans, and of course they want us to believe that it's about purification and not Purim. Of course, the Purim are Jews who celebrate the slaughter of 75,000 Persians under Haman, and they have this annual celebration of this massive human sacrifice ritual that they did. And so let's see. Holly, again, we're back at 1649. You want to get into the fifth monarchists?
Well, I want to say a couple of things. I will talk about fifth monarchists. Was someone in the chat brought up class? So the intersection of class here. So I have found that these groups are constantly called the merchant class, and that's why Parliament was popular. And basically the Magna Carta took over as well. It was like the merchant class coming up and trying to usurp the power of the monarchy. And so the merchant class was promoted by Puritanism through divine grace and predestination. You know, if you were doing monetarily well, then you are obviously chosen by God. And as well as banning Christmas, they also cracked down on alms to the poor. So they promoted this idea of, you know, a Puritan or Protestant work ethic, you know, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and let's not offer alms to the poor anymore. So that also caused riots within England because it just went after centuries of how the English had lived as Christians. So you had mentioned the levelers as well, and we touched on them a bit, but they were tied in with the suffrage movement. So a lot of people don't really think that 1649 they'd be talking about suffrage, because we think of that as something that happened, you know, in the New World, and then it didn't happen until like the 1800s. But we see the foundation of it starting under the levelers and in 1649.
Now, lots of talk about the Magna Carta in the chat here, and people are saying it was nonsense because it was null and void. Now, we have to realize that it was used to undermine rule by logos, which came down from the divine right of kings, which if you want to read an example of a proper emperor or king, you would want to read a book like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, as that would be like a true king who lived under logos and truth and did everything by honor and everything. And this is what they don't want people to grasp. So, you know, the Magna Carta was all about using, no taxation without representation, etc. And free speech and all of these things. These were used to promote these undermining of these, the ability to undermine society from logos, and it was sold as free speech, women's liberation, and all of this stuff. And of course, they had to hype that women were suppressed. And when you get into what logos was, they've spun the whole thing. They've inverted everything all the way through.
So can I jump in about the fifth monarchists?
Oh, yeah. I thought, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so the fifth monarchists and the Quakers came out after what they called 1649 to 1660 under Cromwell was called the interregnum. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. That was following the English Civil Wars. So the interregnum was the Cromwell Commonwealth years. So the fifth monarchy believed that there were four ancient monarchies before: the Babylonians, the Persians, the Macedonians, and the Romans, and that they needed the Puritans to take over to bring in revelation, end of the world, and the return of Christ. So they thought that 1666 would be the year of revelation and indicating the number of the beast. And of course, as we talked about briefly, and you showed your book, the plague and the fire, 1666, was both the year that there was a massive unknown plague throughout London that wiped out a massive number of people in London. And then there was a giant fire, the Great Fire of 1666 in London. And basically the whole of the city of London had to come out of that, and old London was rebuilt as a city-state, pretty much.
Right. And a lot of this is hard for people to understand because they're so used to hearing how wonderful the Magna Carta is and all of these things, and they don't, first of all, they don't understand Logos. They don't understand Marcus Aurelius. Of course, and Robert and I were talking about this recently. Robert Rowe, who's been on the show several times, and he brought this up, that Stoicism was created to make the illusion that Stoicism and Christianity were separate. When it's when you get what Logos is, that is Christianity, and anything that's inverted away from that isn't. So when somebody does behavior against that, that's obviously not Christianity. So you can't blame the Christians for something that was done out of Logos, and that's the what people need to understand when they get into this stuff. So Chad. I hope that helps you begin to understand this. But the whole process of what we've been told is inverted, and they use this, the Magna Carta, etc., to promote this degeneracy throughout history. And it's like when you start reading and looking at this stuff, you have to start questioning many of your core beliefs of what we've been told throughout history. I mean, Holly and I are like daily having to question things that we thought was true since we were like in 5th grade or whatever in some BS social studies class,
Yeah, it's kind of hard. I mean, I went to school for political science, got my bachelor's in political science, and I really love and I'm fascinated by the Revolutionary War era and early American history, and we're all taught to love the founding fathers and the Bill of Rights. And then I started to notice as we're looking into this, like the same groups and the same people keep popping up. And we've talked about Ben Franklin several times in previous episodes, and he was a Quaker, of course, and his family was directly tied in with pamphleteering, which all of these groups, the ranters, levelers, diggers, all these people are based around pamphleteers. So that's where the PR section starts to come in, and you also see the American Revolution era, the end of the Salem witch trials, I think, in my mind, launched the Enlightenment era, and then that launched the revolutionary period in the United States and in France. So I haven't completely figured this out yet, but it's all starting to point in that direction.
Yeah, we're starting to get some more trolls in here. Now, Chad, I guess, Chad, when we're talking about inversion, he says it's a fancy way of saying lying. No, that's actually very separate. Under lying, you have hundreds of different fallacies. An inversion is a specific type of lie where you invert something. Now, unlocking the power here, I'm guessing, is probably a troll. They use the same, always the same stuff, always the same comments. So, I don't know. Let's just block that. We don't need the Satanists in here. Bye-bye.
I mean, if they want to give us like $5 or something, that'd be cool. But...
All right, I'll put them on a timeout. But if you're promoting Satanism and anti-truth rhetoric, and if you're going to say that they're all the same and you haven't even bothered to read them yourself, you don't belong here. We like an audience that's educated. I put them on timeout.
Someone in the chat also talks about Freemasonry too, and of course, this always completely is an overarching theme amongst all this. All these groups, all these individuals are seeing they're Puritans, they're pamphleteers, they have some connection to Harvard, they're connected to the Freemasons. You can take a look at that. You can look in Jan's database brain for that as well and just go for that.
Yeah, we're going to move on from Chad. He's not grasping some of this. It's all right. I know it's a lot to understand. The Emancipation Proclamation he brought up, it's probably more like, yeah, that is another really inversion because they didn't really free. When you look at the Emancipation, the slaves were really freed out of the South so that they could be moved as slave, or cheap labor into the factories in the Industrial Revolution in the North. And it was just a moving of people, and then they destroyed the South and bankrupted it, et cetera. And that's a whole other thing to get into. But you have to realize who originally brought the slaves in. Of course, that was the Puritans and Rhode Island and the Antinomians, the do what thou wilt, the Satanists. Those were who brought the slaves in. And, of course, that's all been spun against the Christians. anybody who knows, who's read the book, you're not supposed to enslave Christians. So now going into the last of these notes here, let's see. So we've kind of, I guess that we've kind of already covered it all. So those were all the key points that we wanted to discuss. Again, thank you everyone for your donations and support. It's been a rough week and we still have more research to do. We need to plan another trip back to Salem very soon as we get the funds for that. Holly is going to be out here next week, and then we're going to be working more on the book. We're trying to get the book done in months, but we keep discovering more and more and more. So how quick we get it done is a good question. How can you enslave non-Christians? Well, if you live in Logos and truth, anyone who is not in Logos and truth is technically a slave, but that's a whole other subject to get into that would require you doing lots of reading. And of course, as somebody's bringing up Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights came out of the Magna Carta, and again, it's like, when you get how they invert these things to use them against us, but sell them to us as good things, rights. I mean, your right to speak freely should be self-evident, but all of this stuff is constantly being inverted. It's an actual inversion of the fact. You flip it over. Of course, there's ad hominem attacks or slippery slope fallacy, poisoning the well, red herrings, all of these different fallacies that we've taught and talked about with the Trivium for years. But if people go back to the show 2 weeks ago on inversion, that is a very specific type of fallacy or lie. See, yeah, Chad Warren is still confused over things. Let's just forget that guy. So anyway, it's like you get caught into the free man movement and anarchy. The anarchy comes out of the antinomians, and when you realize that society needs laws and rules to function properly, you don't have pedophiles running in the streets. The libertarians love to sell drugs and porn and all of this stuff without any repercussions for the damage it does to other people and family and society as a whole. And you can start to see how these things are used and promoted. But you have to, if you ask the wrong questions, you'll never get to it. If you set up all your questions assuming that you already have the answer, you'll never come to a different conclusion.
So just a follow-up for the audience, if you want to do some research on your own, I just recommend you just type in antinomian controversy and just look at that from a perspective of founding the United States. This is how a lot of the American colonies were founded, especially in New England. And it talks about just a modern philosophy and ties into the Enlightenment. So I'm pretty happy that we stumbled upon that because it creates a larger subtext, I guess, for us to explore the Salem witch trials and the book that we're working on.
Right. And I'm really glad that you came up with that because, in what was it, 2014, I had written about antinomianism in my article, and I had defined it there, realizing that they were attacking Christianity and how they had flipped everything. But when you get in there and you understand this whole antinomian thing and how all of these different groups stem out of the Puritans, and the Puritans came out of outlawed Judaism in Europe from the stuff that was going on there, then you begin to see the whole picture playing out repeatedly throughout history. So someone in the chat's bringing up pirates. So I think that might have to be one of the next shows. And also, Jan found some really fascinating research about how the town of Salem and how wealthy it was and all of the merchant ships there and all the underground tunnels that you found. So that'll be some further research that we do. And even, so we're going to go so far as secret tunnels tying in with the Salem witch trials. Right now, I don't know if that book was stolen, though. It's just not in the stack here. Hopefully it's out in the car somewhere. But, and Holly pointed this out. So Salem, now I discovered that Salem, and we had showed a book on screen, Salem was the richest town in America, but it wasn't just the richest town. Other places considered Salem like a country unto its own. So it would be like Washington, D.C., City of London, Morocco. What are some of the others that you came up with?
Vatican.
The Vatican, right? So it was that wealthy. And, when you read these official histories by the roaches and whatnot out there that publish the disinfo, they want you to believe, I shouldn't say that. I haven't finished reading that book specifically, but in general, caveat, what they want you to think is that, the Puritans and the people living in Salem were these dumb morons, and they lived in little shacks and they didn't have anything, and they're like, just like milking the cow, churning the butter like a Weird Al Yankovic tune or something like that, and that this is the foundation of all of this. But when you get in and you understand that, that the whole history is fake, that this was the wealthiest city in America, that Harvard, was behind all of this with the Royal Society, they're promoting inoculations, they're promoting, this whole antinomian theme, then you can begin to grasp and see what's going on. And I know that so much anti-logos propaganda has been promoted since Salem that people are just caught in this same mindset that, hey, we should attack, rather than questioning why everyone attacks Christianity and logos, figure out what it is by reading and studying yourself firsthand. So I'm done. If, Holly, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's a good way to wrap up for tonight. I mean, there's so many topics that we could jump into about our book. So this is just another way that we were able to tie the Puritan era back to your research on the hippie movement.
All right. So, and we'll follow up with more in depth on all of this stuff soon. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.